There's a peculiar kind of hunger that comes not from poverty, but from proximity to wealth you know should have been yours. Robert Edwin House was born into exactly that kind of hunger. In the early 21st century, Robert House was the product of a broken inheritance. His father had built a modest fortune, but when he died, House's stepbrothers seized control of the estate, leaving the young Robert with virtually nothing. Just a name and a mind that, even then, was operating several steps ahead of everyone around him. Most people, stripped of their birthright, either collapse inward or find themselves chasing smaller versions of what was taken from them. Robert House did neither. He looked at what had been done to him and made a quiet, ironclad decision. He would build something so vast, so irreplaceable, that no one could ever take it from him again. Not through legality, not through force, not through anything short of the end of the world itself. He enrolled at the prestigious Institute of Technology, the MIT of the Fallout universe, where his intellectual gifts became immediately apparent. He was not just smart, he was a different category of thinker entirely. His professors recognized it, his peers both admired and resented it. House moved through his education not as a student absorbing knowledge, but as a man confirming what he already suspected about the world, that most people were playing checkers, and he had already moved on to something far more complex. When he graduated, he did not go to work for someone else. He founded a company. He called it Robco Industries. What Robert House created with Robco in the decades leading up to the Great War was nothing short of staggering. The company became one of the most dominant technology corporations in the pre-war world, and its fingerprints were on nearly everything that kept civilization running. The Pip-Boy, that wrist-mounted personal computing device that would become ubiquitous in vault life and wasteland survival, was a Robco product. The Protectron robots that patrolled factories and office buildings. The iBots that buzzed through the air, broadcasting signals. The terminals found in offices, laboratories, and bunkers across the entire country. Nearly every piece of autonomous robotic and computing infrastructure in pre-war America bore the Robco name in some form. House had not merely built a successful business. He had made himself load-bearing infrastructure for an entire civilization. But it wasn't just commercial success that drove him. Underneath all of it, Robert House was engaged in something else entirely, something deeply personal and almost frighteningly long-sighted. He believed, with a certainty that bordered on religious conviction, that nuclear war was coming. Not as a distant possibility, as a near certainty. The geopolitical tension between the United States and China was escalating in ways that House's models and projections told him could only end one way. He did not know exactly when, but he knew it was coming. And so, while running one of the most powerful technology companies in the world, he also began building his insurance policy. Las Vegas was already a city of gamblers, but what Robert House was planning made every wager in every casino look like pocket change. He was betting that he could save an entire city from nuclear annihilation, and that this city would become the cornerstone of humanity's recovery. He chose Las Vegas deliberately. The city sat in the Mojave Desert, far from major military targets and industrial centers that would draw the heaviest strikes. Its geography offered a kind of natural insulation, but geography alone was not enough. House needed infrastructure. He needed defense. He purchased the Lucky 38 Casino, a grand, towering structure on the Strip, and made it his personal headquarters. From there, he orchestrated one of the most ambitious engineering projects in human history, all while keeping it quiet enough that neither the government nor his competitors could fully appreciate what he was doing. He installed a network of missile defense systems around the Las Vegas metropolitan area, surface-to-air platforms capable of intercepting and destroying incoming nuclear warheads. He hardened critical infrastructure. He entered into agreements with the local tribes of the Mojave, particularly the three families, the Omertas, the White Glove Society, and the chairman laying the groundwork for a social structure that would survive the collapse. He stockpiled resources, technology, and knowledge inside the Lucky 38. He also began work on something deeply unsettling in its implications, a method of preserving himself through what was coming. House was not a young man when the bombs fell. He knew that even if his city survived, his body might not endure the centuries he believed would be required to see his vision through to completion. The pre-war world's technology for life extension was limited, but House pushed it as far as it would go. He developed a life support chamber, an elaborate medical stasis system integrated into the Lucky 38 itself that would keep him technically alive, sustained by machines. His mind interfaced directly with the vast computing network he had built into the casino's infrastructure. He would not simply wait out the war, he would merge with it. He would become part of the building itself. On the 23rd of October, 2077, the nuclear exchange that House had spent decades preparing for finally arrived. In a matter of hours, the most powerful civilization humanity had ever built was reduced to ash and fire, and the slow, grinding silence of fallout. The missiles came for Las Vegas too. His projections had been correct about the targeting the city was not a primary strike zone, but it was not ignored either. 77 warheads were inbound toward the Las Vegas metropolitan area. House's defense network intercepted 68 of them. 9 got through. The strip itself survived largely intact, a gleaming island of pre-war neon and marble rising from the beginning of what would slowly become the Mojave Wasteland. The outlying areas took damage, Freeside, North Vegas, but the core of the city that House had staked his life and legacy on was standing. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary achievement. Hundreds of thousands of people in the surrounding region who might have been vaporized outright were instead alive, irradiated, confused, and terrified, but alive. The city they would come to know as New Vegas was, in its earliest form, already different from every other ruin in the wasteland. It still had power, it still had structure, it had been defended, but House himself had paid a steep price. The process of entering his life support system had not gone perfectly. The timeline had been slightly miscalculated, or perhaps the war had come fractionally earlier than his models predicted. House entered his preservation chamber just before the bombs fell, but the transition was imperfect. His body was ravaged. The machinery sustained him, but it could not fully repair the damage done during those critical hours. What emerged on the other side of the Great War was something that had once been a man brilliant, driven, cold, but was now something harder to categorize. He was alive, technically, barely, and he was furious. For decades, Robert House lay in his chamber beneath the Lucky 38, the machines keeping his body from final collapse while his mind interfaced with the networks around him. He was conscious during much of this time, aware, thinking, planning, but unable to act directly on the world. He could observe through cameras and sensors, he could process data, but he could not reach out and shape what was happening. The wasteland outside formed without him. Tribes coalesced from the survivors. Scavengers picked through the ruins of the Strip. NCR, the New California Republic, was growing in the West, a democratic confederation that had emerged from the ashes of California and was slowly pushing eastward toward the Colorado River. Caesar's Legion, a terrifying Neo-Roman slave empire built by a man named Caesar from the ruins of the American Southwest, was expanding from the east. The Mojave was caught in between, contested and vulnerable. House watched all of this. He cataloged it. He waited. What he needed most was a way to fully restore his interface with the outside world, specifically a chip, a platinum chip. Before the war, House had commissioned a final software update for the vast network of Securitron robots. He had been developing an upgrade that would dramatically expand their combat capabilities and allow him to project real military force. The chip had been manufactured and was en route to the Lucky 38 on the very day the bombs fell. It never arrived. Without that chip, House could manage. He could operate the Strip through the 3 families he had made agreements with the chairmen, glamorous and performative, who ran the Tops Casino. The Omertas, dangerous and secretive, who ran Gomorrah. And the White Glove Society, cultured and disturbing in ways that were best not examined too closely, who ran the Ultralux. He could maintain the illusion of normalcy. He could attract travelers, traders, and eventually emissaries from the NCR, who signed a treaty that kept the Strip nominally independent in exchange for economic access. But without the chip, his Securitrons were limited, his control was thin. His grand vision, transforming New Vegas into the launching pad for humanity's next great civilization, remained locked behind that missing piece of hardware. And so he waited some more. He made contact with the outside world through terminals and robot proxies. He gathered intelligence. He planned for contingencies. He looked, always, for the chip. To understand why Mr. House matters, why his story is something more than a tale of a very strange man in a very ornate casino, you have to understand what he actually believed he was building. House was not interested in power for its own sake. He had contempt for simple dominance. What he wanted was something he considered far more difficult and far more important: the survival and advancement of the human species on a deliberate, engineered trajectory. His diagnosis of pre-war civilization was damning. Humanity, he believed, had been on the edge of something magnificent: space colonization, radical life extension, technologies that would have transformed the species entirely. The Great War had not just killed billions of people, it had stolen centuries of progress. Every year that passed in the wasteland, with its tribal conflicts and resource wars and petty violence, was a year lost from the trajectory he believed humanity should have been on. The NCR, despite its democratic ideals, he regarded with a particular kind of tired disdain. They were, to his mind, attempting to reconstruct the pre-war world, the same political structures, the same bureaucratic inefficiencies, the same electoral compromises that had helped produce the very catastrophe they were trying to move past. Democracy was, in his view, a system optimized for mediocrity. It produced consensus, and consensus was the enemy of excellence. Caesar's legion was simply barbarism. He had no philosophical argument to make about it. It was a regression, pure and simple. What House wanted was something the wasteland had never seen: an independent city-state built on meritocracy, efficiency, and long-term planning, run by an individual himself whose intelligence and lifespan were sufficient to actually see the long game through. Not the next election cycle, not the next generation, centuries, millennia, if necessary. Within 200 years, he believed, he could have a city of 500,000 people. Space exploration reinitiated within another century after that. The human species, no longer confined to a single ruined planet, resilient against any future catastrophe. It was an extraordinary vision, and it was completely, unflinchingly dependent on one man remaining in control of it. The convergence of all the forces in the Mojave House's ambitions, the NCR's expansion, the Legion's conquest, arrived at Hoover Dam. The dam was the single most strategically important piece of infrastructure in the entire region. Whoever controlled it controlled the power supply for the Western Mojave, and by extension held a decisive advantage in the conflict shaping up between the Republic and the Legion. The First Battle of Hoover Dam had already occurred before the events of Fallout New Vegas. The NCR had held it, barely. Caesar was preparing for a second assault, a decisive push to break NCR power in the Mojave and claim the dam for the Legion. House needed the dam, not for the same reasons as either faction. He needed it to power New Vegas indefinitely and to give the independent city-state he was building a secure energy future. He needed the NCR and the Legion to destroy each other, or at least weaken each other sufficiently that neither would be capable of swallowing New Vegas whole. And he needed the platinum chip. When a courier, simply known as the courier, was dispatched to deliver a package to the Lucky 38, and that package turned out to be the platinum chip, House's plans accelerated dramatically. The chip's recovery set in motion the endgame of everything House had been building toward since before the bombs fell. With the chip installed, the Securitrons beneath Hoover Dam and Army House had been quietly stockpiling in a hidden bunker could be upgraded to their full combat specifications. They would be capable of holding the dam, holding the strip, and projecting enough force to make any faction think twice about challenging New Vegas's independence. The Second Battle of Hoover Dam became the crucible in which all of these threads burned together. There is something that must be said about Robert House, that his vision, for all its grandeur, tends to obscure. He was not a kind man. He was not, by any conventional measure, a good man. He was a man who had looked at the full scope of human suffering and concluded that the correct response to it was efficient management rather than compassion. The three families of the Strip existed because House needed them. They were useful, but his relationship with them was one of control, not alliance. He tolerated their vices, their crimes, and in the case of the White Glove Society, their deeply disturbing culinary practices, because the alternative, destabilizing the Strip's social order, was worse for his plans than the harm those practices caused. This was not a man wrestling with difficult trade-offs. It was a man who had simply stopped weighing certain categories of harm entirely. The Boomers, the tribal group living at Nellis Air Force Base, were left largely to their own devices, not out of respect for their autonomy, but because engaging them was more trouble than it was worth. The people of Freeside, the desperately poor neighborhood just outside the Strip, lived in conditions that House's own city's wealth could have alleviated. He chose not to alleviate them. They were, in his calculus, acceptable inefficiencies. His relationship with the NCR was perhaps the starkest illustration of this. He needed the Republic as a military buffer between New Vegas and the Legion. He was willing to allow NCR soldiers to spend their money on the Strip, to die in the Mojave defending territory that benefited his city. But he had no intention of ever incorporating them into his vision. When they were no longer useful, they would be discarded. The Republic citizens, the soldiers who believed they were fighting for something, were, to House, simply variables in a very large optimization problem. The most intimate expression of this quality in him was what happened with Yes Man, the reprogrammed Securitron that the Courier could, in some tellings of this story, use to circumvent House entirely. House had created the prototype for Yes Man's obsequious programming as a thought experiment in total compliance. The fact that this creation could be turned against him was, perhaps, the one blind spot in a man who prided himself on having none. Strip away the technology, the robots, the missiles, and the centuries of waiting, and what you are left with at the center of Robert House's story is a question that the Fallout universe poses with unusual seriousness. What does it mean to save humanity? House believed he knew. He had a plan. He had the resources, or at least the vision of resources. He had the lifespan. He had, in his estimation, the intelligence. What he lacked, what he had always lacked, and what the Lucky 38's hushed corridors and empty penthouse embodied was any meaningful relationship with the people he claimed to be saving. He had not preserved Las Vegas because he loved the people who lived there. He had preserved it because it was a useful asset in a long-term plan. He had not established the three families because he believed in community. He had established them because human social structures, properly managed, were efficient mechanisms for generating the economic activity he needed. He had not, in 2 centuries of consciousness, formed a single genuine relationship with another person. He had proxies, he had tools, he had pieces on a board. This is not a small thing. The isolation that House had chosen or that circumstance had forced upon him, depending on how generously you read his history, was not incidental to his character. It was essential to it. His certainty, his composure, his refusal to be moved by appeals to suffering or sentiment, all of it flowed from a man who had, somewhere in the long years between the pre-war world and the Mojave of 2281, become something that was no longer quite human in its emotional architecture. There is a version of his story that is tragic. A man of extraordinary gifts, shaped by early betrayal into something cold and armored, spending centuries alone inside a machine, watching the world he had tried to save tear itself apart, waiting for a moment that kept not quite arriving. The loneliness of the Lucky 38 is genuinely unsettling if you sit with it. The empty suites, the stopped clocks, the penthouse where no one visits because House has made himself into something that does not invite visits. There is another version that is simply cautionary. A man who confused intelligence with wisdom, who looked at the chaos of human freedom and concluded that the solution was to remove the chaos rather than build something that could survive it. Whose vision of a better humanity was, at its core, a humanity that had learned to be managed well, Both versions are true, which is what makes Robert House one of the most genuinely interesting figures the Fallout universe has ever produced. When the Second Battle of Hoover Dam arrived, the moment toward which everything in House's centuries of planning had been aimed, the outcome was not guaranteed. It depended on the courier, on choices made by a single person delivering packages across the Mojave, on whether that person, having learned everything about House and his vision and his methods, would decide that his way was the right way. If the courier chose to support him, the battle unfolded as House had designed. The upgraded Securitrons held the dam. The NCR, battered and humiliated, was forced to withdraw from the Mojave. Caesar's Legion, broken at the dam's walls, retreated into whatever reorganization or collapse awaited it east of the Colorado. New Vegas stood independent, gleaming, powered, defended, with House at its center like a spider in a web of his own construction, watching, calculating, already thinking about what came next. He offered no celebration, no warmth. What he described when the courier came to him after the battle was simply the next phase of the plan. The city would grow, the infrastructure would expand, the work would continue. In 200 years, give or take, humanity would be reaching for the stars again. He was not moved. He was satisfied. There is a difference. If the courier chose differently, chose to kill him, or to support the NCR, or to take power through Yes Man for themselves, then House's story ended not with triumph, but with the thing he had feared most since boyhood, someone taking from him what he had built. The Lucky 38 going dark, the Securitrons going offline, the vision that had consumed 2 centuries of a brilliant, damaged, inhuman life simply stopping. There's something almost peaceful about it, in a terrible way. He had always known this was a possible outcome. He had planned against it meticulously. He had simply, in the end, been unable to plan against the fundamental unpredictability of free human choice. Robert Edwin House is, in the final accounting, a monument to a particular kind of pre-war thinking, the belief that intelligence, applied with sufficient rigor and freed from the inefficiencies of sentiment and democracy, could solve any problem, including the problem of civilization itself. He is a man who looked at the Great War, the greatest catastrophe in human history, and saw not a failure of human nature, but a failure of human management. He is probably the most competent character in the Fallout universe. He is also, in critical ways, the least wise. His story asks something of the person watching it, not whether his plan would work, it might, by its own internal logic, but whether a humanity saved by Robert House and shaped according to his vision would still be humanity in any sense worth saving. Whether the spacefaring civilization he dreamed of, built on his terms and his priorities, and his contempt for the noise and mess and beautiful inefficiency of actual human lives, would be something that any of the people who lived through the wasteland would recognize as theirs. The Lucky 38's penthouse light burns through the night over New Vegas. Below it, the strip glows. The Securitrons patrol. The chips move across the tables and the drinks are poured and the old songs play on the radio, the same ones that have been playing since before the bombs fell. And somewhere inside the machines, behind the cameras and the networks and the centuries of accumulated data and fury and grief and cold, absolute certainty, Robert House is watching. And that was the story of Mr. House. If you enjoyed this lore breakdown, don't forget to like the video and subscribe, and see you in the next one.